Have you ever had the distinct, unsettling feeling that your life is being managed by an invisible script? You wake up, check an app that quantifies your sleep quality, and log into a job that demands you be passionate and agile. When you get off work, exhausted, you open a streaming app that serves you a documentary about how corrupt the system is. You're not in agreement. Hit like, purchase a t-shirt with a radical political slogan from an online marketplace, and go to sleep. You feel like a free individual. You can say what you want, buy what you want, and criticize whomever you want. And yet, nothing changes. The architecture of the world remains entirely untouched. In the 19th century, oppression was obvious. It was a factory owner with a stopwatch, a stark line between the exploiter and the exploited. Back then, the solution seemed simple. If the machine is crushing you, you band together and break the machine. But today, the machine doesn't crush us. It accommodates us. It gives us remote work, mental health days, organic snacks, and personalized algorithms. We live in an anesthetic age, a world where 99.9% of the population is psychologically sedated, not by a totalitarian dictator, but by the very comforts, choices, and liberties we fought to achieve. To understand how we trapped ourselves in this invisible cage, we have to learn a dangerous way of looking at the world, a philosophical tool called dialectics. Dialectics is the study of how things change through conflict. It shows that nothing is static. Everything contains its own internal contradiction, and the clash of those contradictions is what drives history forward. But in the mid-20th century, a group of radical philosophers looked at the modern world and realized something terrifying. The system had learned to play the dialectical game better than we. They realized that the dominant economic system no longer fought its critics. It consumed them. Today, we are going to look into the abyss of critical theory to discover how our workplaces, our media, and our algorithms manufacture our consent, and why, in a world that allows all forms of rebellion, true resistance feels completely impossible. Before we watch this machine swallow our reality, we have to understand exactly how the tool used to break it works. We need to dissect dialectical analysis. To understand dialectics, we first need to understand three classic laws that were modernized during the period of German idealism by G.W.F. Hegel, and that were eventually adapted by Marx and Engels into material dialectics. First, there is the unity and conflict of opposites. This law states that everything contains internal contradictions. We cannot have light without also having its antithesis, dark. Interestingly, this line of thought is also present in Saussurean linguistics and semiology, but that is a topic for a separate video. Second, there is the passage of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. This law states that small, gradual, quantitative changes accumulate until they reach a sudden, fundamental shift in the qualitative nature of things. Interestingly, this concept is present in some contemporary theories of organizational and social change, again, a topic for a future video. Third, there is the negation of the negation. This law states that history and development don't move in a straight line or a perfect circle. They move in a spiral. A new stage overthrows or negates the old stage, but a third state then overthrows that one, retaining the best elements of both previous states at a higher level. Dialectics is the philosophy that everything is interconnected, constantly changing, and driven by internal contradictions. Dialectical analysis is the method of studying a subject by identifying its opposing forces and tracking how their conflict leads to a completely new stage of development. Most of us are taught to look at the world through simple cause and effect. A leads to B. The world is a collection of static, isolated objects. But dialectical analysis says that's an illusion. It looks at the world not as a snapshot, but as a movie. It asks, how did this thing become what it is, and what is it currently turning into? To perform a dialectical analysis, We must look for the hidden internal friction driving all development. It's traditionally broken down into a three-part engine. First, there is the thesis, the starting status quo, a dominant idea, or an existing state of affairs. But a thesis cannot exist in a vacuum. By its very nature, it generates its own opposite, its own internal friction. This is called the antithesis. The antithesis isn't just an external enemy. It is a contradiction born from within the thesis itself. They are locked in a fatal dependent struggle. Now, standard logic says that one side must win and the other must lose. But dialectical analysis reveals a deeper truth. The conflict resolves into a synthesis. The German idealist philosopher G.W.F. Hegel used a very specific word for this transformation, Aufhebung, which means to simultaneously cancel, preserve, and lift up. A synthesis doesn't just split the difference or form a sloppy compromise. It cancels the limitations of the old conflict, preserves its core truths, and leaps forward into a completely new, higher reality. And here is the twist. The synthesis immediately becomes a new thesis, which will generate a new antithesis, spinning the wheel of history forward in a continuous, upward spiral. When Karl Marx took this tool, he applied it strictly to material reality in the 19th century, creating materialist dialectics. He analyzed history by looking at class struggle. For Marx, the thesis was feudalism, kings and serfs. The internal friction of feudalism gave birth to a merchant class, the bourgeoisie, which became the antithesis. Their clash overthrew the kings and created a synthesis, industrial capitalism. But capitalism immediately created its own internal contradiction, the industrial working class, the proletariat. Marx predicted that this clash would inevitably spark a new synthesis, socialism. But this is exactly where history hit a wall. This is where the engine jammed. Enter the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory in the 1930s. These German intellectuals looked at the world and realized Marx's prediction was failing. Capitalism wasn't collapsing into socialism. Instead, the friction was yielding fascism in Europe and hyper-consumerism in America. They realized they needed to apply dialectical analysis to something deeper than just factory ownership. They needed to apply it to culture, psychology, and the concept of human reason itself. In their foundational 1947 text, Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno applied dialectical analysis to the myth of human progress. The thesis is the Enlightenment. Humanity uses science, logic, and reason to conquer the terrifying forces of nature and free humans from myth and superstition. The antithesis is that in our obsession with dominating nature, we become obsessed with control, calculation, and efficiency. Reason stops being a tool to liberate people and turns into an industrial tool to calculate and manage people. They called this mutated monster instrumental reason. In the synthesis, the Enlightenment concepts of progress and reason became intertwined and yielded a totalitarianism that transmogrified the entirety of humanity into a dark, cold, bureaucratic calculation. In this way, the very ideals intended to enlighten humanity by freeing it from myth and superstition actually became a totality that united humanity in a different way. Instrumental reason doesn't ask why we are doing something, it only asks how to do it more efficiently. It reduces everything and everyone to a metric, a spreadsheet, or a cost-benefit analysis. When a society stops asking why and only asks how efficiently, human beings become nothing more than numbers to be optimized. And this instrumental mindset moved directly from the mid-century state apparatus into the modern corporate boardroom. In traditional Hegelian dialectics, the clash between a thesis and an antithesis resolves into a higher, more complete truth, the synthesis. Adorno, however, disagreed with this optimism and developed the concept of negative dialectics. Adorno argued that a forced synthesis is often just the dominant power system crushing deviations and forcing conformity. Negative dialectics refuses to look for happy endings or neat resolutions. Instead, it uses dialectical analysis to relentlessly critique contradictions without trying to resolve them because they are, in the final analysis, irresolvable. It is through the lens of negative dialectics that the transmogrification of humanity into a dark, cold, bureaucratic calculation found in the synthesis of Enlightenment thought and its antithesis becomes clear. The synthesis, far from being a resolution of opposing thought, was dominated by the Enlightenment concepts of progress and reason. But how does a system that treats people like numbers avoid a revolution? Why don't the 99.99% rebel? It is because the system learned how to weaponize the dialectic against us through a mechanism Marx called subsumption. In the early days of capitalism, the system practiced formal subsumption. It took an existing way of working, like a cobbler making shoes by hand, and put a price tag on it. The cobbler still worked the same way, but now for a wage. Eventually, this shifted to real subsumption, where the factory completely redesigned the labor process into an assembly line. The brilliant leap of the Frankfurt School was realizing that today, real subsumption has escaped the factory walls. It has swallowed our culture and our critique. In the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse argued that rebellion does not occur because modern capitalism had successfully integrated the working class by satisfying their material needs with consumer goods. Marcuse argued that society has the technological capability to free humanity from grueling labor, but instead it uses that technology to force people to work harder, to buy more consumer goods. This is an example of subsumption. Freedom, therefore, becomes a mechanism of control. Because people can choose between so many brands and variations of a given product, they feel free, but they are actually one-dimensional because they are unable to think outside the existing system. By shifting dialectics from the factory floor to the television screen and the human psyche, the Frankfurt School showed how deeply modern capitalism shapes not just what we buy, but how we think and feel. In short, unlike Marx's prediction, capitalism was not collapsing, it was adapting and thriving. Remember our dialectical engine. A thesis is supposed to be broken by its antithesis. A radical critique is supposed to disrupt the system. But our modern system doesn't fight the antithesis. It assimilates, monetizes, and neutralizes it. Think about the punk rock movement, an anti-establishment scream against the systemic decay. What did the system do? Corporate record labels signed the brands. Fashion conglomerates turned the anti-style into a mall aesthetic. Within a few years, punk was a commodity. The philosopher Herbert Marcuse called this repressive desublimation. The system strips a radical critique of its political teeth and turns it into a lifestyle choice. Your anger at the system is redirected into a purchase that feeds the system. Look at corporate wokeism or environmental compliance frameworks today. When massive social critiques about climate change or systemic inequality gain cultural traction, corporations launch a marketing campaign. A mega bank that invests billions in fossil fuels will fund an urban community garden or host a diversity seminar. The language of liberation is co-opted. Words like revolution or radical, which once meant dismantling power, are now used to sell software updates or electric SUVs. This creates one-dimensional thought, a concept Marcuse examines in his book One-Dimensional Man. The tension between what is, our flawed reality, and what should be, a utopian alternative, is collapsed. The system buys up the alternative and sells it back to us, turning the contradiction into a feature, not a bug. Nowhere is this closed loop more suffocating than in the modern workplace. The organizational environment has completely mastered the manufacture of consent. It has done away with the old, overt authoritarianism of the 1950s boss shouting at employees. Instead, it uses a far more insidious tactic, the real subsumption of human subjectivity. You are invited to bring your whole self to work. It sounds empathetic, it sounds progressive, but dialectically, it is a total capture of your identity. In order to think like a critical theorist, you must look at the achievements of modern society and relentlessly ask, what is the hidden cost of this progress? When you see a smart home device that makes your life incredibly convenient, you must also see the corporate surveillance apparatus it installs in your private life. When you see a social media platform that connects the world, you must also see how it commodifies human attention and reduces human relationships to an algorithm. When you bring your whole self to a corporation, your personal traits are itemized and weaponized for capital. Your natural empathy is channeled into customer success metrics. Your genuine creativity is harvested for corporate branding. The boundary between who you are and what you do for a living is completely erased. And notice how the flexibility of remote and hybrid work has mutated. It was celebrated as a victory for workers, but dialectically, what did it actually achieve? It demolished the physical boundary of the office. Because you can work from anywhere, you are now expected to work from everywhere. The market has successfully colonized your home, your living room, and your evenings. We willingly log back on at 9 p.m. We manufacture our own consent because the anesthesia is flavored like comfort, flexibility, and belonging. So where does this leave us? If you are like me, listening to this line of argumentation doesn't feel like hope. It feels like despair, because for change to happen, a critical mass of society would be to comprehend this invisible machinery and actually do something about it. But that is highly unlikely to happen, given the system's anesthesia that impacts 99.99% of the world's population. The Frankfurt School thinkers stared into this exact same bleak reality, and toward the end of their lives, their definition of hope had to shrink dramatically. Theodor Adorno grew so cynical that he compared his philosophical writings to a message in a bottle, cast into a vast, dark ocean. He knew the public of his time wouldn't awaken, but he wrote anyway, hoping that some future generation, living in a moment when the system inevitably crumbled, might find the bottle, read the message, and realize that someone else had seen through the illusion. Marcuse had argued that the anesthesia would wear off when the system itself suffered an internal crisis, a failure to deliver the consumer goods and comforts it had promised. Yet contemporary history shows that even when internal crises emerge, such as constant worldwide financial meltdowns, the goal of both politicians and the majority of humanity is always to restore the broken system to business as usual. Thus, it seems even the emergence of crises is not enough to break the spell. But there is a final, strange comfort hidden within dialectics itself. Dialectics reminds us that no totality is permanently unbreakable. The more total, rigid, and expansive a system becomes, the more complex its internal contradictions grow. The 99.99% anesthesia we see today isn't a sign of the system's absolute peace. It is a sign of its absolute desperation. The fact that modern organizations, tech platforms, and media conglomerates must spend billions of dollars every single day on algorithmic curation, targeted advertising, corporate culture engineering, and political theater proves how terrifyingly fragile the system actually is. It requires a non-stop, monumental injection of energy just to keep the world asleep. The system is a human creation. It relies entirely on our participation and our psychological submission to function. And because it is a machine running at maximum capacity, it is bound to eventually break its own gears. The first step is realizing and understanding the mechanisms that make humanity unable to rebel. And it goes without saying that the comforts we have examined in this video are also employed in many workplaces to neutralize potential employee critique before it can form. To be sure, these comforts and perks are not the only tool employed, but they are one component of an arsenal of tools leveraged to keep employees thinking in one-dimensional terms and remove attention from the deep misery and contradictions of modern organizations. A critical mass might not wake up tomorrow because of an intellectual epiphany, but history shows us that empires don't last forever. They all eventually choke on their own success. Until then, the most radical thing you can do is refuse to forget that the cage is bare. Protect your inner life from the logic of the market. Keep the contradiction open. And if nothing else, pass along the message in the bottle.